Nuremberg, June 1946, the Palace of Justice. Albert Speer rises to testify wearing a grey flannel suit, loose on his 6-foot frame after over a year in custody. The judges from 4 Allied nations lean forward. Speer adjusts his wire-rimmed spectacles and begins. Factories humming with efficiency. Production lines that defied Allied bombing. Armaments output that tripled between 1942 and 44. Tank production up 200%. Aircraft up 300%. Ammunition up 400%. He speaks with the calm authority of an engineer presenting blueprints. Terrifyingly specific, completely persuasive, also completely fiction. And that fiction would become the foundation of the most durable myth in modern military history, that Albert Speer, organizational genius, prolonged World War II through sheer managerial competence. But the documents were in the room. The real production charts. The actual numbers. And if the judges had looked at the dates on those charts, they would have seen that Speer's miracle never happened. He didn't save Germany's war effort. He just lied about it better than anyone else. In this video, you'll discover what Speer actually inherited from his predecessor, how he manipulated statistics to create phantom production increases, why slave labor destroyed the efficiency he claimed to achieve, when the real production collapse happened, and how Speer's lie shaped post-war understanding of Nazi Germany for the next 40 years. If you want history that follows the data instead of the mythology, subscribe. February 8th, 1942. Fritz Todt dies when his Heinkel He-111 crashes on takeoff from Rastenburg. Hitler's architect, the man who designed the Reich Chancellery with its 480-foot marble hallway, inherits the Armaments Ministry. Albert Speer, 36 years old, no manufacturing experience, no military background. Over the next 24 months, German war production appears to explode. The numbers Speer presented at Nuremberg show relentless growth. Tanks and assault guns combined rising from roughly 6,000 in 42 to over 17,000 in 44, though pure tank production reached approximately 9,000. Speer's statistical methods often blurred these categories to maximize apparent growth. Messerschmitt fighters rolling off assembly lines at rates that make Allied intelligence panic. The implication is obvious. Speer cut through Nazi bureaucratic chaos with rational planning, centralized control, technical expertise. He becomes the good Nazi in post-war imagination, the technocrat who focused on production while ignoring politics, the businessman who managed the war machine without asking whose blood greased the gears. This narrative survives in business school case studies. MBA programs still teach Speer's rationalization of German industry as supply chain genius. There's one problem with this story. The production increases didn't begin in 1942. They began in 1940, under Todt's management. By the time Speer took office, German industry had already completed the mobilization that Britain and the Soviet Union finished in 1939. The British converted civilian factories to war production immediately upon declaration. The Soviets relocated entire industrial plants east of the Urals, while German panzers rolled toward Moscow. And Germany continued significant civilian production, consumer goods, luxury items, far longer than its enemies, well into 1941. Not because of incompetence, because Hitler believed the war would end by Christmas 1940. Why disrupt civilian production for a conflict that would be over before the factories could retool? When that assumption proved catastrophically wrong, Todt began the conversion. Between 1940 and 41, ammunition production increased significantly through the unglamorous method of extending factory shifts and standardizing shell calibers. Aircraft production jumped from 800 units monthly to 1,200, what might be called scorched peace, stripping civilian consumption to the bone because total war demanded it. Speer inherited this momentum. Todt's reforms were already working. Production lines were humming. The conversion was complete. But at Nuremberg, Speer erased Todt entirely, claimed he found an economy operating on peacetime principles and transformed it through administrative brilliance. He didn't spark a miracle. He walked into a room where the lights were already on and claimed he invented electricity. Then he did something worse. He invented growth that never existed at all. Before Speer, the Reich Statistical Office tracked war production honestly. Tanks in one column, artillery in another, aircraft separately. You could see exactly what Germany was building. Speer collapsed these into a single aggregate index: weapons production. Then he changed what counted as a weapon. Railroad cars full of barbed wire for concentration camps became military equipment. Cooking stoves for the Eastern Front counted as armaments. Captured French trucks were added to vehicle totals alongside Panthers and Tigers. When actual tank production dipped in late 43, when factories produced only 300 Panthers instead of 600, Speer stopped publishing tank numbers separately, buried the decline inside aggregate statistics that included horse-drawn carts and repaired motorcycles. The curve kept rising because he kept changing what the curve measured. It was like claiming you grew taller by switching from feet to inches. The fraud peaked in January 43. Speer announced the Adolf Hitler Panzer program, promised 800 tanks monthly, actual output that spring 450 tanks. Speer's monthly reports to Hitler 780, then 810, then 825. How? The ministry manipulated aggregate statistics by including repaired vehicles, sub-assemblies, and changing the baseline calculations, effectively masking declines in actual combat-ready output. When field commanders complained that Panthers broke down within miles of delivery, the ministry adjusted reporting methods to obscure the mechanical failures. Allied intelligence bought it. British economists studying captured documents in 43 concluded German industry had achieved total rationalization. Calculated Speer's system was 40% more efficient than Allied war production. This was exactly what Speer wanted them to think. Reality. According to post-war analysis, German productivity per worker was declining approximately 15% annually after 42. Why? Because the system Speer created prioritized statistical appearance over mechanical function, and maintaining that illusion required something he rarely mentioned at Nuremberg: bodies. Winter, 1943. The Mittelwerk tunnels at Nordhausen. Temperature, 48 degrees year-round. Perpetually damp. Carved through gypsum rock 400 feet beneath the Harz Mountains. This is where Speer's miracle actually lived, not in organizational charts. In 40,000 slave laborers working 12-hour shifts, often 7 days a week, 84-hour weeks, on 1,200 calories daily, the nutritional value of a modern frozen dinner. Speer called this redeployment of labor resources. The SS called it extermination through work. The reality, economic cannibalism. To maintain the production curves he showed Hitler, Speer demanded ever greater numbers of forced laborers, foreign workers, prisoners of war, concentration camp prisoners, to replace German workers drafted into the Wehrmacht. By 1944, roughly 25% of Germany's industrial workforce consisted of foreign forced laborers and POWs, with concentration camp slaves like those at Mittelbau forming the most brutalized component of specific terror-driven programs. And what happened in those tunnels reveals the true cost of Speer's miracle. His ministry's internal reports documented the problem. Slave labor productivity ran 40 to 60% below that of free German workers. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and deliberate sabotage, missing parts, contaminated fuel systems, defective components. The V-2 rocket program, Speer's proudest technological achievement, consumed 2 billion Reichsmarks. Roughly 60,000 prisoners passed through the Mittelbau camp system. At least 20,000 died. To produce over 6,000 rockets, of which some 3,000 were launched. Early batches saw failure rates above 30%. Rockets exploding at launch, breaking up in flight, missing targets entirely. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by it. Speer knew. His own ministry's internal reports he didn't present at Nuremberg, acknowledged that slave labor efficiency ran 40 to 60% below free German labor. But he kept expanding the system, because admitting the truth to Hitler meant admitting the production numbers were fiction. So the tunnels grew longer. The bodies piled at the entrances, literally because the SS often didn't remove corpses until they blocked the tram tracks carrying rocket components. And the statistics kept climbing. What happened next revealed something worse than the fraud itself. It showed how Speer hid the collapse even from himself. Spring 1944. The USAAF launches systematic attacks on German synthetic fuel production. Between May and September, raids on facilities like Leunawerke reduced German aviation fuel output by over 90%. Tank production continues. Aircraft roll off assembly lines, but they can't move. They can't fly. Speer himself called this the beginning of the end. His response wasn't rebuilding the fuel infrastructure. It was lying faster. He created industrial triage. Shut down actual production of finished weapons while continuing to report raw material processing as armaments output. Steel ingots rolled from foundries that no longer had machinery to turn them into tank armor, counted as armaments production while they rusted in rail yards. When the Ardennes offensive began in December 1944, German units faced fuel shortages, not primarily because refineries were bombed, though that was catastrophic, but because Speer's ministry claimed fuel production at 60% of capacity when actual output had fallen to 15%. The tanks had nothing to run on. The real production collapse began September 1944, months before final Allied offensives. Speer's own ministry records, uncovered in the Bundesarchiv in the 70s, show aircraft production fell 40% between August and November 1944. Tank production dropped by half, but the official reports Hitler read showed increases of 10% monthly until January 1945. Speer had constructed a Potemkin economy of spreadsheets, maintained it even as the Reich contracted to Berlin's suburbs. At Nuremberg, he told the court he prolonged the war by many months through organizational brilliance. The actual effect was opposite. By hiding the production collapse until negotiating an armistice became impossible, Speer trapped Germany in a war it had already lost, ensured the complete destruction of the country he claimed to save through efficiency. He wasn't the architect of German resistance. He was the accountant of Germany's downfall. We wanted to believe him. The post-war world needed a good Nazi, a technocrat who proved the Holocaust was committed by monsters, not ordinary men doing their jobs efficiently. Speer gave us that narrative. He wrote it in Spandau prison, memoirs that became bestsellers, interviews that shaped a generation's understanding of the Third Reich as a state run by madmen and bureaucrats rather than engineers and accountants who knew exactly what they were doing. He died in 1981 in London, still insisting the Armaments Miracle was real, still claiming he didn't know about the death camps even though his ministry's tunnels were carved by concentration camp labor. The myth survived because we need to believe competence and evil are incompatible. They're not. The Armaments Miracle was statistical fraud built on slave labor, repaired vehicles counted as new production, rockets that killed more prisoners building them than enemies they hit, an economy that looked impressive on spreadsheets while soldiers froze waiting for ammunition that didn't exist. Speer didn't save Germany's war effort. He concealed its disintegration until negotiating peace became impossible. The documents don't lie, even when men do. Albert Speer was the only defendant at Nuremberg who accepted responsibility. He admitted knowing about forced labor, acknowledged the regime's crimes, expressed remorse. The judges gave him 20 years. Others were hanged. Post-war historians praised him as the technocrat who tried to stop Hitler. His memoirs sold millions. His methods were studied by corporations and militaries worldwide. But the one thing he claimed as his greatest achievement, the armaments miracle that supposedly kept Germany fighting, was a lie built on manipulated statistics and the corpses of tens of thousands of slave laborers. Here's the question. If the only Nazi at Nuremberg who accepted guilt was lying about his signature accomplishment, what does that tell us about the rest of them? Drop your answer in comments. If this changed how you see Nazi industrial mythology, hit like. Subscribe for history that follows the data, not the myth. Thanks for watching.